Good afternoon. I'm Claire Howard, the Associate Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Blanton Museum of Art, and welcome to our series, Curated Conversations. Today, we're delighted to welcome artists Lisa and Janelle Iglesias, who collaborate as Las Hermanas Iglesias, and whose contemporary project exhibition is on view at the Blanton until July 9th. Hi, Lisa and Janelle. Just a few notes for our audience before we begin. Your audio is muted, so no one can hear you, and only the panelists are visible on the screen. Closed captioning is available by clicking the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking your questions from the Q&A window. Just click the icon below to type and send your questions, and feel free to make comments in the chat window, but please ask your questions through Q&A box so we can make sure we track those. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube page roughly 1 week from today. Now let's introduce our speakers. Sisters Lisa and Janelle Iglesias have collaborated artistically as Las Hermanas Iglesias since 2005, alongside their individual studio practices. Working on opposite coasts, the artists produce playful work in a variety of mediums, engaging issues such as community, feminism, and cultural hybridity. Las Hermanas' artwork draw on their identities as the children of Dominican and Norwegian immigrants and highlight relationships between family members as well as individuals in society, tying the personal to larger cultural systems and promoting cooperation and collectivity. The artists were born and raised in Queens, New York. Lisa Iglesias holds an MFA from the University of Florida and is currently an associate professor at Mount Holyoke College. Janelle Iglesias received her MFA in sculpture from Virginia Commonwealth University and is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego. Las Hermanas Iglesias have been featured in solo exhibitions at Arizona State University Art Museum, Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and the National Nordic Museum in Seattle, among others, and in group exhibitions at the Queens Museum, New Mexico State University Art Museum, the Brick Biennial Brooklyn, Blue Star Contemporary in San Antonio, Mexicarte Museum here in Austin, El Museo del Barrio, New York, and elsewhere. Their work has been supported by residencies, including the LMCC Paris residency, the New Roots Foundation in Antigua, Guatemala, Textile Arts Center, Brooklyn, and the Stone Leaf Artist Residency in Kingston, New York, and by grants from the Queens Council for the Arts and the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures. Their current contemporary project debuts work that draws on the sisters' own navigations of fertility, pregnancy, loss, and birth. The exhibition examines caregiving as part of a complex network of social issues and holds space for the complexity and nuance that inform a wide range of reproductive and caregiving experiences. Today, we'll be learning more about that exhibition and Las Hermanas' larger practice. Lisa and Janelle, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Claire. As we begin to share our presentation, I just want to give a shout out to that song. I've never heard that song before, and I think it was rather perfect. Janelle, I would totally pick you.
I always pick you.
Thanks so much for having us today. We're honored to be here, Janelle and myself, as Las Hermanas Iglesias, and we have a lot of people that will share gratitude with throughout our talk. Our talk is really going to go through a wide variety of our practice, sometimes chronologically, sometimes going back and forward in time. Janelle and I will probably interrupt each other, tell bad jokes.
Oh, yes.
Forget names and dates, and makes lots of mistakes, and give a little background to the work that we're showing at the Blanton. Janelle, do you want to share some gratitude?
Oh, so much gratitude for everybody at the Blanton. It's been an amazing journey working with Claire and the whole team there. And we were in Austin in December, and it was both of our first times there, and we can't wait to return. But it's really exciting to be here with all of you and to share a little bit more about what went into this project and kind of where it came from and our practice in general.
We're going to start out with a territory acknowledgement.
So I am zooming in this morning in San Diego, California, which is the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation.
I'm joining you from South Hadley, Massachusetts, located in Western Massachusetts on the ancestral land of the Nonotuck people and the neighboring indigenous nations of the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. So our moniker of Las Hermanas Iglesias, we like to oftentimes ground our presentations with talking a little bit about what our moniker references, of course, it being our last name. But when Janelle and I started to work officially together in around 2005 in a sort of studio context, we chose this name for a wide variety of reasons, and including, and in no priority order, the emphasis on multiplicity, the fact that our identity is so much rooted in our relationality as sisters, as family members, and for the vernacular of our home, our ancestors, Queens, our birthplace. For many reasons, Las Hermanas has been sort of this grounding North Star for us.
And in our kind of, our ideas around ourselves in terms of our identity, we are the youngest of 4 sisters. So we're also thinking about this relationality as sisters as something both very personal and close to us, but also something as a larger term in terms of thinking about a kind of way of being in the world as a feminist and as a kind of relationship that's an intimate relationship between people, whether they're biological siblings or not.
In terms of our sibling dynamics, and big love and shout out to our 2 older sisters, Jenny and Kristen. These photographs show Janelle and I, because we are so, our ages are so proximate. Maybe we'll have a little, can we have a bet in the chat or something for who's older with no internet
knowledge?
Janelle and I have always been close comrades, playmates, enemies, frenemies, best friends.
All of it.
Collaborators from birth, and we were often treated as twins in terms of privilege and like when you might be able to like ride your bike down the street, or in terms of clothing, like here we are wearing very similar Norwegian national vestments called bunads, but also in our everyday day-to-day life, we would often be dressed the same as well. So that's sort of twinning, even though we're not twins. Really, I think, influenced a lot of our worldview and our life experiences as well. And that close experience fed into all sort of areas of our life. And in terms of collaboration, in that way, we've been collaborating since birth. And in this drawing that you can see here, one of my first drawings, I was very upset when I found out that Janelle had collaborated on this drawing and wrote about it and documented it as such after the fact.
These are childhood photos of our mom, who grew up in Folldal, Norway, and our father, our mom Bodhild, and our father Bienvenido, who grew up in the Dominican Republic and in the United States. And something that also really struck me when looking at this slide as we were entering was how much Lisa's youngest child, Lucia, resembles our mom, and how much my 2-year-old Gus really resembles in a kind of uncanny way these pictures of our dad at about 2 years old. And one of the other reasons that we wanted to include this is we definitely also think of very much of ourselves as New Yorkers who grew up with immigrant parents as a kind of identity. Our mom immigrating from Norway, our father immigrating from the Dominican Republic, and we grew up in Queens, which is one of arguably one of the most diverse places in one of the most diverse cities in the United States. And our community was a community of immigrants. And so we really, that's always been like a very strong influence both on us and in our work in terms of thinking about our family and trying to unpack our parents' experiences and our experiences.
That's so true. I did not notice that before, but now that you say it's so obvious. And something that also came up when you said that was this idea that you and I often work with semblance and mimicry and counterfeit, and sort of like a call and response where you try to kind of matchy, but it's a sort of futile situation. And here we can see that also in the DNA passed in our ancestral line, and you bringing up the semblance with the next generation is really interesting. This is the home where our mom grew up in. I think another thing that's interesting to mention is that our father really grew up in a very urban experience, growing up in Santo Domingo, and he spent a lot of his formative years on the grounds of a concrete mixing factory, and had a very urban experience. And our mother had a very farming rural experience growing up in a somewhat remote mountain village called Fuldahl. And this is the house where she grew up with her 7 brothers and sisters, where they would sometimes put a goat up on the roof to mow the grass. That structure, and one of the reasons I think that we kept that slide there in this order is because I think the structure really harks to some of the strategies that Janelle and I use, and you can see sort of like the cultural motifs. Some of the oral histories will surface time and time again throughout our work, both collaboratively and also individually. So we also wanted to broach just a tiny bit about into our individual practices. And here you can see an example of one of Janelle's shows.
So this is an exhibition from like way back in 2012, but I think it really exemplifies that I try to work with and through objects and materials that are very recognizable, and they're often scavenged on site. And my work also very often reacts to specific sites and contexts in different kinds of ways. Yeah, maybe the next slide. This is a piece when I had just moved to San Diego, California, for instance, and was thinking about both the beach culture here and the greater history of the region, and the region as a kind of border region as well. And so it's made out of these terracotta planters, handmade terracotta ceramic work, and these styrofoam parts with all these other pieces accumulated into it. There's lots of different overlap between Lisa and I in our individual work, and those kind of things I think also have been like really fertile seeds for things that happen in our collaborative practice as well. And this kind of attention to materiality and the hand and the kind of mixture of the found and the handmade is one of those things that I think happens in both of our practices, Lisa.
Which is why we insert this slide of my individual work of an installation, which included found objects, as well as kind of meticulously rendered by hand drawings and forged sculptures and materials ranging from concrete to asphalt to paper collage to graphite drawings and salt growths on top of objects. And so again, the inspiration or the references to our parents' experiences and the oral histories that were gifted to us come up again and again in some of the imagery and materials that you'll see throughout our practices. So kind of taking a jump or bash into, no pun intended, our collaboration. That was a terrible joke. We're going to start out with one of our projects. Janelle and I really like to blur the lines between so-called disciplines or historical disciplines and lines between things, especially since our kind of foundational educational experiences were very discipline focused, Janelle in sculpture and myself in drawing and painting. And so we like to blur those lines. So this idea that a sculpture can be both an object, but also a performance, an opportunity for performance and audience engagement or human interaction. And so in this project, for example, we each made self-portraits of ourselves out of paper, and then we activated them as piñatas by bashing each other's paper embodiment, to play out in a tongue-in-cheek fashion issues of sibling rivalry, sibling dynamics, and kind of poking fun at issues of competition. And this project also enabled us to inject really direct audience engagement so that the visitors were able to walk up and take the sort of candy viscera from the sculptures, and that the sculptures also had this timeline that they had one kind of being and state of existence, and then it had this performative, interactive, activated moment, and then it had this other chapter of its life where it became a floor-bound sculpture with a direct reference and full love and respect for Felix Gonzalez Torres, an artist who comes up again and again in our studios as this inspirational force.
I'm going to put a link in a chat to a compendium that we were really excited to contribute an essay to that talks a little bit more about our background, our individual journeys, and how we kind of came to art making and also came to teaching, and our thoughts about pedagogy as well, and pedagogical thoughts also about collaboration in general. And so Lisa and I have a very fluid practice in terms of our collaboration and how that might manifest, and that fluidity continues and expands beyond just working with each other. And we also work with other musicians, writers, artists, experts, novices, communities, and family members. And some of our work is very project-based, and that we'll be invited for a specific project, and we'll design that project all around the context of that interaction, of that participation in that community. And other works are meant for particular spaces, but also fluidly move in and out of different kinds of contexts. Early on, I think, in addition to kind of exploring our sibling relationship, we were also really interested in exploring our family. And so this is a piece where we collaborated with both of our parents as well as a series of musicians. It's called Everybody Likes to Dance. It's a dance floor with a hand-painted dance diagram on it. And the dance diagram combines both the dance moves for a very typical Norwegian dance called the pulse, which is a little bit like a polka, and the dance moves for a very, distinct Dominican dance form, the merengue. And we worked with a series of musicians and created an album of all these different mashups of these two very particular songs that were curated by our mother and father. And so Lisa's going to play one of the songs from that series.
And Janelle, let me know if it's a little bit too loud, okay?
I can't hear it. No.
You couldn't hear it?
No.
But
I can try to play it on my computer and see if you can.
Okay, let's try that.
Hear it in the background, maybe? We could try that. Okay, I'm going to just try to play it as ambient sound on my computer, and everybody, you tell me if you can hear it.
Okay.
So that's a mix by Chris Scoris. I'm going to try to find the original music info to put that in the chat as well. But this hand-painted dance diagram was an invitation for viewers, participants, museum goers to dance on top of and really activate it, not just as a painting, but as a dance floor. And then there were also these customized dance balls, disco balls in the ceiling as well, that kind of created a festive atmosphere.
And there was a range of sounds that evolved from collaborations with these musicians, and some of them were very danceable and some of them were much more like sonic experiences. But throughout, you could really hear at times synchronicities and at times like jarring disharmony between the different kind of sensibilities of the music, but very much you could still hear and sort of the maintenance of the integrity of the original music. And as part of that installation, viewers could take away a poster of the dance diagram that was on the floor. And that was, again, a direct nod to an artist, in this case, Andy Warhol's dance diagrams that were paintings that were taken off the easel and laid down and displayed on the floor horizontally, which was an influence on us in terms of different ways of how to activate or challenge or disrupt kind of assumptions of how traditional disciplines might be approached. So for example, you can see this exhibition at Present Company that Janelle and I had the opportunity to have a solo exhibition there. You can see in the center at the bottom of the screen an artwork that takes into consideration works on paper as a opportunity for almost like a picnic sculpture lunch. And in this show, it was one of those one of the first ways that we began to cast our hands, as well as to really abundantly mine from our childhood home and kind of misuse or objects that we found there. So whether it was medical equipment or a cane or TV dinner trays, taking these objects and kind of reconsidering their formal uses, and through a mashup aesthetic or strategies of remixing, seeing what kind of visual new associations that we could inject into the work.
And in this show, we were also really playing with this idea of making a sculpture that was a drawing in space, and making a drawing that felt more like a sculpture, and having pieces that kind of confused our ideas about what we were looking at, essentially. There were also all these different kind of manifestations of the hand. And so there was the found and the manipulated, and there was also the kind of the hand drawn as well. There was images of shells and photographs of shells, real shells, drawings of shells, for example, like these kind of, all these different pops and like kind of pings of objects and materials in the show, and images of those objects as well. And this was right after our father had passed away. We were also kind of going through our family house and cleaning it out. And so I also kind of think that like no matter how conceptual a project is, for us, we're also really interested in combining it with our personal, emotional, and psychic life, and what's going on in our lives always kind of collapses into the project and becomes part of the project as well. And yeah, those are casts of Lisa and I's hands. And this project kind of fed into a project at Arizona State University's Art Museum in Tempe, Arizona, which we entitled Resistors. And this is also an example of the kind of wordplay that we use throughout our practice, a lot of times in our titles of works themselves, in text-based works that are part of installations and part of shows, in posters, and in titles of exhibitions themselves. So really thinking about this idea of and play between a resistor as a kind of this idea of resistance, and also regarding sisters as well.
Yeah, I think that playfulness really harks to the collaboration and relationship between Janelle and I, where we were often inventing games or looking for games or looking for reasons to entertain ourselves or inject absurdity into our life from an early age. And to create kind of challenges and that could turn into games. And so we would do this in a variety of ways when we were younger, and we do that still today, like in our series of competitions and performances that we do. And in here, inviting the audience to challenge perhaps something like a sense, like taking away their eyesight for a moment to make a sculpture, and then inviting them to introduce the sculpture into a hallway that led into that exhibition at the ASU space. That a central part of that kind of that space had this wall that had this porous window system of niches that light was able to permeate. And because of those little openings and windows, the sculptures that the audience members produced, where we were able to put them inside, and they were there on view for the duration of the show, so that they became part of the show, and that the show reflected the community who was attending the exhibition. And that idea of like windows and creating porous kind of breakages within boundaries and fences and territories came up as a really strong player in this show. We were invited to look at the storage of the museum, and there were these different pieces of furniture and objects that were that the museum was in the process of deacquisitioning and sorting out. And so these museum walls that they were about to get rid of, we were interested in activating them as this new sculptural potential. And so driving holes into, carving into, breaking apart, and creating these opportunities for threading through really became this metaphorical way to talk about permeable boundaries.
And of course, this is 2017. This is when the conversation around The wall on the southern border to Mexico is in, kind of full effect. And it was, as soon as we saw the gallery space and we saw this particular gallery, external wall that had these glass bricks and was letting light in, it was such a powerful experience walking into the space. And we really wanted to have this kind of conversation around this idea of letting the light in. And so there's also in this show and in others, you'll see we used yellow as a kind of sense of light, of sunlight, kind of permeating the space. You can't see in this image, but there's another full wall in the gallery that was painted completely yellow. And we also wanted the hands to kind of gesture towards the kind of performative sense of making a sculpture, like it being kind of an active, like happening. It's both like a still object, but also there's a sense that that there's something happening in the sculpture as well. And this is a piece called Force Field right in front of that wall. And there are handmade kind of geodes and other kinds of gemstones that are attached to the structure that's kind of floats off of the floor. And also we were thinking a lot about this idea of attracting different kinds of energy. And you can see the yellow wall in the image here.
To go back to that just for one moment, I think what will come up later when we talk about Plum and Fathom with the contemporary project at the Blanton Museum, it's so much about community, a multiplicity of network and mutual aid and systems of handing off and handing to. And here you can see that this was one of those projects we wanted to show because we were really starting to think about that, how to visualize relationships in terms of verbs and activations of opening, of sharing, breaking apart, opening and helping. And that kind of extension of or a translation from one to one. That's my attempt at a segue. Is manifest here in in the projects that we're going to share with you today with our textile pieces or textile projects. That we had a few projects that predated the one we're showing you here with our mom, where we invited her to engage some of the knitting and textile work that she had inherited and worked on with her family members from a very early age. And she has passed on quite a few of those techniques with us from when we were young in terms of sewing, knitting, crocheting, embroidery, etc. in our home. And she's also served as, among many other roles, as the main translator in our home, as the sole person to speak fluent English, Spanish, and Norwegian in our household. So to spin off on that kind of role and relationship to translation, we approached her about translating paintings on paper to knit surfaces. And so we began this long relationship that has now really evolved into many different ways of how we as a collaborative team interact with textiles. This was one of the first ways that we began to do that, the pairing of works on paper to knit paintings. And we're interested in the sort of static and differences and similarities and evolutions that happen from this one-to-one relationship, the impossibility of the perfection, and also our resistance to that perfection. We're not interested in that at all. We're more interested in the sort of surprises and magic that can happen when there's a translation from one material to another. And we were really able to experiment with that relationship through our residency at the Textile Arts Center.
And so at the Textile Arts Center, which is an amazing organization in Brooklyn, New York, we had applied to do a residency as a family. And our mom was there every week full time. Lisa and I were both teaching. And so we were kind of coming in and out as we could during the residency. And the residency included getting to know a cohort of amazing peers that were also working specifically within textiles, having access to workshops, having access to equipment such as looms, having access to an amazing library, and just the kind of expertise, community, and know-how of so many people. So just huge shout out to that amazing organization. Um, we were doing a lot of experiments with found textiles and sort of redying them and working on top of them, textiles that we had in our family through gifts or through trips to other places, and had sort of been passed down in our family for different reasons. And then also Lisa's putting her cursor on a kind of sampler that integrates all these different kinds of found threads that our mom was integrating into all of trying all these different kinds of stitches and patterns. And when we would come in, we would do another section of it. So it's also a kind of dialogic sampler, and that we would just work on different sections with different kinds of threads and colors and try different things on top of that.
And notably, I think also it's like an extension of that exhibition at Present Company, which Janelle and I think maybe is the first time that Claire saw our work, but well, we can mention that again in, at the Q&A. But this is also another project where we activated this approach of display, where we can use kind of a collage of object and joinery in order to thread together and hang together disparate objects, whether it's different ponytails or found objects or weavings. Here you can see up of that.
And sometimes there are very like specific anecdotes or symbols or things that we're thinking about. And sometimes those things are much more intuitive and random and kind of dialogic. And like, I want to try this, and then another person will add that. But I will say for the kind of textile work and working together, the images of the works on paper, I also just wanted to mention that that's been a kind of foundational part of our kind of practice together as artists. Our practice started in graduate school when we were sending works on paper back and forth and kind of dialogically adding and taking away and collaging and sewing on top of pieces of paper and having this kind of visual conversation. And we've continued that practice of works on paper over 15, 20 years. And so this next project, Mother Tongues, that we did with our mom is at the National Nordic Museum, and it was about 6 years worth of work that we had been collaborating with our mom, and also incorporates a lot of these works on paper that we would draw from and then use as a kind of starting point for a textile work or a translation of a textile work. Also for the work for the show, we were developing it at the Textile Arts Center when we were learning a lot about textile history, and got all very interested in Annie Albers as the kind of mother of modern textiles. And we were having a lot of conversations with our mother around this divide between fine art and craft, and also the divide between women's work and men's work, and what was valued and what was not, and whether or not one is an artist or a maker, how we would even define those things, and what role making plays in our lives, all of these different things. So many of the works in the show have very personal meanings. There's a knit translation of a woven rug that's also incorporated into the installation, and you can sort of see it in the center, a rag rug that's made out of the clothes from the community in Folldal, where our mom grew up. It's also one of the few objects that's sort of our inheritance. Several of these rugs were brought over by other family members, and each one of the sisters in our family has one of the rugs as our inheritance. But she was also very well known for making these rugs and made up her own patterns. And so some of the motifs that we're drawing from are also, drawing from the motifs that she was using in her weavings as well. And an aside, the yellow that we're using in this exhibition was called Nordic Yellow as the name of the color. But also really thinking about this idea of letting the light in, and thinking about optimism as well as a huge influence in our practice and in our work, letting the light in.
So you can see, like Janelle mentioned, the patterns, whether they're derived from kind of geologic or nature-based formations, the way that our grandmother thought about mountains or other kind of land-based forms, or whether they were increasingly, then we started to inject kind of references to the body and line work drawings that really amplified and unapologetically or unabashedly really reflected anatomy, anatomical processes, and images that really spoke to our identity. So that work was also very much influenced by our experience at another residency. Shout out to La Nueva Fabrica and the residency called the New Roots Foundation in Antigua, Guatemala, where we were able to not only really relearn, keep on learning, make mistakes and fail at weaving and other textile processes, work alongside artisans at the Nueva Fabrica, and really work together in person at the same time and kind of evolve the way that we were working with textiles, where it wasn't so much us inviting our mom to collaborate and doing a one-to-one, but now we were really much more learning, continuing to learn from her, making these parts all at the same time that then could be joined together. So injecting totally new strategies of creating knit surfaces and textile works in a variety of different manners, so that we could really kind of start to continue expanding the ways that we work with fibers and with knitting, whether it's by taking those patterns and taking those kind of physical strategies and then bringing them back into works on paper and drawings, and to be influenced again by anatomical, the anatomy, or to start to mix together different textile processes, whether that's weaving with knit, with crochet and sewn surfaces, and really kind of complicating the ways that we make our textile works. So by learning at La Nueva Fabrica and New Roots Foundation together in person, we were able to kind of just continue that continuum of learning in a variety of ways that we'll keep on speaking about. And we really think about knitting, crochet, embroidery, yes, as historicized, kind of labeled women's work, also as ways of mending and repairing, documenting history, creating, growing, and building community. And so that metaphor, that textile is this like really formative or like fertile place for meaning, has come into our takeaway posters, and we've thought about it in like political terms. So we've and then those sort of strategies for making fabric pieces has now opened up into making flags, or building relationships between our takeaway posters and other kinds of forms of sharing these things. We wanted to share this takeaway poster at the Nordic Museum, where we invited my son Bowie to collaborate with us. So it's another kind of way that we extend the collectivity between our family members, where it doesn't have to be one way from one to one, or there is not just one way of collaborating. There's many different ways of inviting kind of input, and how we might continue to be inspired or react to each other. So here you can see that Bowie was doing drawings based on the knit paintings that were based on works on paper. So continuing that kind of translation kind of game of telephone, and which created a poster that the audience could then activate in a different way. So again, like, how can an object have like a timeline and continue to change its life? It can morph and turn into other things. It can be activated by audience members. How can we continue kind of complicating an assumed fixed identity?
This show also had an audio tour by Bowie. We've done this in a couple of other exhibitions where we've invited Bowie to look at different pieces and talk about what he thinks about them. And then we've made an audio tour that you're able to access online. I'm going to put a link in the chat if you'd like to hear some excerpts from that audio tour for that show.
So that our roles as parents and the experience of giving birth has been really radical to our practice. And rather than kind of perceive our roles as parents as limiting to our careers or our roles as artists, we are again and again returning to the philosophy of celebrating these roles and complicating these roles and talking about them, and not trying to keep these issues siloed from each other. So this is an example of a project that has a long, indeterminate time life that keeps on changing and evolving, and it's called Commissurates. Jill, do you want to talk about this project?
Sure. So when was Bowie born? 2012?
2012.
2012. This project started in 2012 and just kind of started with this conversation around how I might approximate Lisa's experience visually, or kind of like, I think I was trying to carry a watermelon around that was about the same amount of weight as the baby, and then quickly discovered that I wasn't going to do that all day. And so we began taking these photos. These photos are all both posed and like intentional and also very casual at the same time. So they're all taken with a phone in different places where we are when we can manage to be together. But they've been a gesture that we started and then we continued along with subsequent pregnancies. So that was Commiserates 1 in 2012. This is from Commiserates 2 when we were kind of on a work intensive in Florida at a kind of funny Airbnb. So I also like that the backgrounds of these change so much. And this is when Lisa was pregnant with her daughter, Luna. And so also we have a beach ball in that one. And Lisa, do you want to talk about your experience with Luna?
Sure. In 2019, I had a stillbirth, and when Luna passed, we decided to continue the project. So Janelle came to where I was. So again, the photograph reflects the time period, and that the cabbage and that the hospital issue underwear, that there are certain signs and signals for what might have happened to this pregnancy. And when I experienced the stillbirth and learned about the prevalence of stillbirth and miscarriage, and the fact that I had not really engaged with the risk and potential, was something that Janelle and I wanted to really amplify and talk about and research. So we began this open source document. Janelle will put this link into the chat. And as it's titled, An Evolving and Incomplete Resource List about reproductive justice topics. And so anyone who perhaps everyone knows someone who has experienced a miscarriage or stillbirth, and you can learn more about these topics by accessing this document. And the reason that we started it was because when I was experiencing my stillbirth, I was looking online, but not really finding any resources that spoke to that didn't really speak to me. And so I wanted to share a much more kind of open framework for how to speak about reproductive justice issues through this document. And so we continued this project. The project continued, right? Like we hadn't thought about these other topics that would come in, but Commiserates has really opened to respond to our lives. And so here, Janelle and I, when we experienced our pregnancies, for myself the third time and Janelle's first time, it was during the pandemic. So in this photograph, we couldn't take that photograph together. We photographed ourselves on the different sides of the country, on our separate coasts. So this photograph becomes a reflection of COVID-19. And then for the first time, when we were able to be together, when the pandemic was more manageable, we were able to come together and then photograph our experiences with our babies together at different time periods. And again, not trying to frame parenting in this kind of one note, joyous realm. Of course, it is that as well. And also to include everything else that comes with it, and if not the everything, that is then as much as we can within this series of photographs. So Commiserates will continue, and it's an open-ended project, and we keep on kind of just learning and responding to where it goes, both geographically and in response to our lives. And really the Blanton project brings a lot of that together. One of the reasons that we wanted to speak so much about our experiences together as sisters, as parents, etc., is because so much of that is within the Blanton show. That comes from our experiences at residencies, for example, as we mentioned, the New Roots Foundation, with the mark making, with the techniques, including dyeing, and learning about natural dye techniques that came into the work at the Blanton Museum, was a direct experience from Guatemala that we continued afterwards this year and the year before. And so this is a weaving that was commissioned at in Antigua, in Guatemala, that we brought with us, and then decided to naturally die with a team of people.
So shout out to Rachel Island Smith and to Bick Haberstraw, who were major collaborators in dyeing this pretty huge fabric, as well as students that came in just to help sort of like lift it. Because once this fabric, was wet with mordant, it was extremely heavy to lift up. So rigging and lifting and having many people on hands was super amazing. So shout out to students who came in to help. The dyes that we used for this project were a combination of dyes. We were looking to get dyes that were a color that were green in hue, but also dyes that came from herbs and plants that were used in family planning. So really thinking about different kinds of knowledge around family planning that have been used for centuries, but have often been forgotten in terms of modern medicine, and the revival also of that kind of knowledge in our present day with conversations around reproductive justice. And so some of this work also was happening at and was formulated, the seeds of which, the production of which was happening at a family residency at Stoneleaf Retreat in upstate New York. I'm going to put a little bit of information about in the chat about Stoneleaf. Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about the work at that residency?
Yeah, so big love to Stoneleaf Retreat and Helen Toomer. We were invited to be residents in the Peggy Toomer family residency, where we could bring our family members here. You can see our canine family member and Macho and Lucia over there. You can see Janelle is getting material ready for casting, and we did a lot of the material, a lot of the work that you see at the Blanton at this residency, where our mom was able to come up, and we were able to do a lot of the casting processes and material and object making with Bowie, my kid, and you can see Bo there, and making the objects that you can see in Plum and Fathom, the installation at Blanton Museum.
And casting is such an intimate kind of experience too, of like needing to sort of like help each other in and out of a mold and timing things and doing it collaboratively. You can see on the left, there's this wonderful banner by Lizania Cruz, A Freedom Budget Provides Childcare for All, and really thinking about how Stoneleaf supports families through providing this opportunity that's really geared towards bringing a family there. Just wanted to plug that.
And in many of these photos, we were looking through all of the process photos that we have. We were often drawn to photos where you can see ephemera from parenting. So whether it's like having an area where a child can take a nap, or to be taking a snack so that you can get a little bit of work done happens, how we kind of organize our space. We also wanted to show process photos so that viewers can see a little bit of where the artwork, how the development and process of what we were doing. We were doing a lot of research into figurines dating back centuries about fertility management and female sources of power and warrior communities. So here you can see a little bit of the visual research that we were doing. And really thinking about these surfaces, again, that speak about a visual language that has to do about textiles, and how textiles is weaving together disparate materials and threads, and how we weave together our the different in kind of autobiographical references and inspirations into the show.
And there's something about the collaging these pieces where the images really kind of look like objects, and also the painting look like textile. It's kind of blurring between forms is something that we're also always really interested in.
In some of the collages, you can see the hand objects that are in Plum and Fathom, as well as the seashells that are directly tied to our inspiration from the ocean and the sea, as because of migration and immigration, and for various other reasons, and also the anatomical references coming throughout the show, whether it's with hands, with reproductive care, et cetera, surface again and again throughout the show.
And these are casts of our mother's hands holding that other textile. These are some installation images coming up from the Blanton. We just also wanted to really amplify and can't say enough thank yous for the assistants there. Their whole team was so amazing in putting this installation together. And so the nature of Lisa and I living on opposite coasts means that we mail a lot of things back and forth. We FaceTime with each other. We send each other articles constantly and images of things that we're working on. We share images of things that we're working on and use them, use those images, or use our color, select from them in Photoshop, all different kinds of strategies. But it means also often that we haven't actually sat with the work in one place or put it together in one place until we are together on site. So while we have a fairly informed idea about what it's going to look like, we don't actually know exactly what it's going to look like until we get there and put it together while we're together. So it was a really amazing week-long installation period of assembling this installation, which incorporates casts of our hands, the hands of our mother and hands of Bowie, Lisa's son. And it's made primarily out of copper, which we're really interested in terms of referencing a kind of plumbing system. Like the name of this show is Plumb and Fathom, and plumb also being a word that's used to kind of interrogate or try to seek a larger, more nuanced understanding of something or trying to find truth. This is a bit of a video just kind of walking casually around the installation, but we're also kind of mashing up this idea of a playground, of a plumbing system, of a kind of bead maze that you might see. It's that classic children's toy. And so there are parts that do and can kind of move across different parts of the tubing, but we're also thinking about our own kind of personal, organic, biological plumbing systems. And we're also thinking about networks and networks of care, networks in terms of like family and community and chosen family, and then also the kind of networks and systems within societies with socio-political networks, networks of law, also oftentimes needing to go around or try to find a way through a kind of a network that's offering resistance. And so this is one of the times in which we had originally actually thinking that we were going to have these two separate pieces, and then in the studio, based on conversations we were having, it really became this one piece where we were really excited to see how the hands were going to interact with the warpage of this textile coming off of part of the frame. And yeah, Lisa, do you want to add to that? Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think that the various strategies and processes and sort of formal compositions and associations between the objects have a lot to do with the neon sign. So Damn It, I'm Mad, a connection to the wordplay that we have broached and so far in the talk and that we engage with. It's a palindrome reading backwards and forwards. To the expression, the title of the work is Dar Luz, which is an expression in Spanish that translates and is used, it translates it as to give light, but is a way that people reference to give birth. And so Damn It, I'm Mad really foregrounding the kind of range of feelings and experiences and responses that humans undergo when interacting with procreation and giving birth. And wanting to encapsulate that kind of full experience. And so that the installation approaches that standpoint by offering all of these kind of labyrinthine kind of ways of maneuvering, and then that sentiment of expansive, and like including this buoyant, verdant statement, but that also is angry, is part of it. And of course that color of green, again, like is that verdant color. It's also really amplifying the green wave of reproductive justice that is going through, that started in Latin America. And so all of these different forces are all part of the sort of caregiving experience for Janelle and I.
Yeah, this is one of the first neon pieces that we've made. And I think just thinking about other formal kind of devices in terms of like painting an entire wall yellow in terms of letting the light in. And the title of that piece being Dar Luz. was really interesting also to see how that light kind of affects the rest of the work in the gallery. So Dammit, I'm Mad is also a palindrome, so it can be read backwards and forwards. And we've often been using palindromes as these statements that have a kind of open-endedness that kind of allude to a kind of truth and timelessness. And this one is another kind of flag motif, and it's "Are we not drawn onward toward new era?" And that's another palindrome that we're excited to be working into a kind of LED light sculpture coming up next.
So here you can see details of various objects, whether they're found objects or made by hand, whether they're manipulated or strung together or taken apart. Jerry rigging is definitely a big part of the way that Janelle and I interact with materials, reuse, regeneration, and a reconsideration. Janelle, since my sound didn't work so well, could you play this? This is an example of another collaboration that we do with Bowie, where he creates these docent-led tours. And I think it's a good way to kind of wrap up the work that we've been showing you today.
Yeah, let me play this excerpt.
Close your eyes for 10 minutes. What does it smell like? What does it look like? I love your imagination. It's so good. Take a friend if you want to. Okay, now it's time to go, lovers. Or time to go.
Bowie's voice has changed a little bit, but the sentiment stays the same. We are available to answer any questions, and we're excited to interact with the group. So if you have any questions that you've put into the Q&A, or if otherwise you want to share that information, Janelle and I will keep on dropping some things into the chat, and we're excited to have a conversation with Claire. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you both. That was so, I think, illuminating about kind of the way your practice has developed and the way it relates to the current show at the Blanton. So thank you both for your thoughtfulness, as always. And I had, a couple of questions for you, but I think you also maybe had questions for each other to get things rolling. And again, as you said, we invite the audience to drop any questions into the Q&A box as well. So would you prefer to ask each other your questions, or do you want me to start?
What do you think, Janelle?
Maybe Claire, if you'd like to start, that would be fun.
Sure. You've been collaborating since 2005, starting when you were both in graduate school, kind of at a distance. And I'm curious how changes in technology have affected that collaborative practice and kind of enabled you to work in new ways. I was thinking the other day about our first kind of studio visit, which was over Skype, which now feels like a million years ago because we're all Zooming now. So are there ways in which changes in technology have affected your joint practice?
Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking immediately in the chat, Janelle shared a link to a book where we have an essay where Janelle and I wrote it together by just using Google Docs, which I think a lot of people have that experience of being able to see an edit or an addition in real time. Something like that came at, in the middle of what we, after we had been working together for a while. So that definitely changed a lot of the ways that we deal with language and text. And we definitely relied on the US Postal Service. Big love to USPS. And now it's sort of, we don't have to wait for the mail anymore, so to speak. Now we can really have an immediate reaction to what each other is working on in real time through FaceTime or Zoom or Dropbox, or like we use so many different platforms. It's kind of ridiculous, but also that ridiculousness and absurdity becomes a part of it, I think, as well.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that we can work through different time zones currently, different and through so many different locations, but also connect with other people through things like Zoom. And also, I think trying to learn about the benefits of certain kinds of platforms. I think that's one of the reasons we try to put so much information in the chat, because as teachers, when we were teaching over Zoom, teaching studio art classes over Zoom was pretty tough. But at the same time, there were things that became really obvious about how about participation and sharing that became really juicy, kind of lovely things to try to figure out if we could continue that energy in other ways. And so yeah, just also being able to, I think that because all institutions were sort of having Zoom talks, having access to so many other talks to share with each other as well, of just like, oh, I listened to this today, I was part of this, and being able to also participate in more kind of conferences and things like that from afar was really, has also been really exciting for us to just sort of be able to be like really nimble in terms of learning. And like, you know, now I've never before listened to audiobooks, but I think that's been something in terms of technology that's been amazing in terms of like being able to read a book on one's commute as well. And then just sort of share, okay, yeah, I listen to this, you have to listen to this in the studio as well, sharing playlists in the studio of even things that we're listening while we're making work together. All that kind of stuff has been pretty amazing. But it's funny to think of like our first initial gestures were so analog, really was like, you know, talking on the phone before a smartphone, but really just these visual conversations of actual works being sent back and forth.
Thanks. We have a question from Ana Trevino in the Q&A asking, how have representations of motherhood in film or TV influenced your work together?
I love this question, and shout out to Ana Trevino, wonderful artist. Thank you for being here. It's so nice to see your name and to hear your question. I love this question because it's something that I think about. The first thing that comes to mind, because I think that this is a really fertile, wide, like that there's a lot of ways to answer this question. The first thing that comes to mind is I started to think about, I started to catalog in my mind moments that miscarriage and stillbirth are mentioned in television and movies and in other kind of moments of pop culture, and sort of seeking them out and wishing that there were more moments of them to normalize and amplify the abundance of statistical, like that this happens all the time. So that's just one kind of way. I think that like how parenting is pictured and manifest and displayed and reflected in pop culture is super, super interesting. I think that the complexities of parenting and the challenges of parenting are becoming more and more reflected in a kind of wider range of ways. And that's exciting because I think the more normalization of a wider range of experiences is going to make for a better informed and more compassionate culture. So that's some of the ways that I react to that question. Janelle, do you have any response to that question?
I think that, you know, I think more recently there's been much more, at least within literature and criticism and writing, much more of a kind of thicker conversation around motherhood and what motherhood and giving birth, what that means. So I'm trying to think of, you know, it's interesting because I'm not really like coming to mind things from television or movies per se, but one of the texts that really comes to mind is Mothering as Essential Labor by Angela Garbes. And that this kind of conversation around also, I'm also thinking of folks like Pauline Gumbs, who really think about mothering as a verb and not necessarily being limited to folks that physically give birth, but really thinking about it as a kind of almost like a technology or way of being in the world, a way of fostering empathy, a way of the ways in which care and thinking about relationality can impact all other kinds of our relationships, if that makes sense. And so, but I don't know, I mean, it would be interesting if people want to put any examples that they're thinking of in the chat, because like none come to mind like right away in terms of thinking about representations in television and film, but that would be a really fun collective brainstorm if anybody wants to add those.
Yeah, and I know that was something we talked a lot about in the development of your show for the Blanton, was the desire to expand narratives around parenting, but also kind of define, the definitions of mothering, parenting, caregiving is kind of what we settled on as a more inclusive way of talking about kind of, I think, that idea of mothering is a verb that you were just discussing, Janelle. I'm wondering, you touched on this a little bit, but I think given that you both gave birth during COVID, that you collaborate, that you work with your mother, I think we've talked a little bit about the opportunities for residencies for families, but I'm wondering if you can talk about, one, kind of specifically what your experiences were, if it's not too personal, during COVID, and then also kind of the more kind of generally practical challenges facing artists who are parents, COVID or not.
Yeah, Janelle, you were pregnant before I was during COVID. And so I think that you had even a more extreme kind of experience with COVID protocol than I did. During my midwife appointments, many times had to go alone without my partner. So that was a big, that impacted my experience quite a bit, I think. But also you had experienced it even earlier, and there was a chance that maybe your partner wasn't going to be able to be present at your birth, I think, right?
Yeah, luckily he was. And also right before I gave birth, doulas were also allowed back into to birthing centers and hospital rooms in a different capacity. So I felt very lucky for that. I think for me, it was really huge not to be able to travel and see my family, or for my family to see me, for our mom to visit Lisa, or have Lisa visit during our pregnancies. And I think there was a kind of, post Lisa's experience with Luna and stillbirth, I think there was also a heightened vulnerability around pregnancy and awareness around that vulnerability. And so to also have that kind of compacted with the vulnerability of the pandemic, also kind of felt like a different kind of pregnancy, I think, as well, in terms of, just being very isolated and not necessarily having access to communities of care that we maybe normally would. So I don't think anybody held our son Gus for like the first 6 months, maybe was the first time we had family members visit and hold them. And that, I think for me, felt like a long time to also just be able to sort of like share this person with our communities and our friends and our family as well. But I also felt so far away from Lisa, and like I wanted to be so close to her during that time as well. So our first reunion that we had, which was the summer of 2021, Gus was about 8 months old and Lucia was about 2 months old. And we flew to Massachusetts for kind of a self-imposed residency of sorts. And we took images for the commiserate series, but that was a really kind of amazing reunion. And the images from that series are really loaded for me, I think, from that particular series, because of that kind of sense of reunion. But also we're kind of both struggling with breastfeeding and trying to kind of figure out those initial senses of how do we keep collaborating within new motherhood as well. And so there was also, both the kind of hilarity of chaos, and like as soon as you would try to do something else would happen, or because we're also dealing with 2 infants at the same time that were maybe on different schedules and things like that. But I feel like we're at a moment where the art world is starting to really question these old narratives around children being a distraction to creative practice, and is really starting to consider the possibility that of artists in general, leading these fuller lives, and having those personal parts of their life be these generative completely acceptable and valued part of their identities, and as well as part of their creative process and what affects their creative drive as well. I feel like that kind of boundaries between the personal and the professional used to be drawn so strictly. And now there's, I think with things like auto theory and I think that there are these kind of cracks that have emerged more recently for them to become part of both like an academic discourse as well as a popular discourse as well. But in general, I also find now that I am experiencing life with a child the things that I used to be interested in terms of a possibility that would be expansive for my practice are just different. And so I think there are a number of organizations that are looking to offer residencies and opportunities with a lot more flexibility and support and longer timelines, and just have a different kind of rethinking around how they might, how those opportunities, programs, residencies, whatever it may be, how they might better support and kind of honor ourselves as full beings, with bodies, with families, with, I think, I hope that there's also just a kind of a larger move in general towards a kind of acknowledging ourselves in relation to each other, and really thinking about relationships rather than thinking about objects and exhibitions and things like that. So I think I feel like there's also this kind of undercurrent of not just thinking about motherhood or families or artists with families, but thinking about community and thinking about being together and thinking about accessibility and these larger issues that also have overlap. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. Sorry.
Thank you both. No, thank you. I think you really wove together the threads of what was admittedly a little bit of a disjointed question. So thank you so much. We're at about 1:13 now. So I think I will close us out and thank you both so much for your thoughtfulness, your collegiality, how wonderful you've been to work with throughout this. And I know all of us on the team here at the Blanton really enjoyed working with you. And I'll thank our audience as well for your attention and your participation. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Our curated conversations series is taking a brief hiatus as we prepare for our new grounds opening this spring and all the new programming that will go along with it. We encourage you to sign up for our Blanton newsletter at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe to make sure you get all the latest info and event updates. Also, if you'd like to show your support for the Blanton, you can become a member today at blantonmuseum.org/membership. You can watch the entire curated conversations series at blantonmuseum.org/curated conversations. And you can learn about volunteer opportunities at blantonmuseum.org/volunteer. Thank you again, Lisa and Janelle, and to our audience. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Bye.